The camera was live. The audience was laughing. Sandra Bullock had just delivered the punchline to a story about her latest film when her eyes locked onto something in row 7. Her smile froze. The microphone slipped slightly in her hand. Jimmy Fallon noticed it first, the way her face changed, the color draining just enough that under the studio lights it was unmistakable. He stopped mid-laugh, turned toward her, about to ask if she was okay. But Sandra was already moving. She dropped the microphone onto the guest chair, stood up, and without a word of explanation, started walking toward the audience. Not the casual celebrity wave and smile walk. A purposeful, almost urgent stride down the steps of the stage. The entire studio fell silent. 200 people holding their breath. The cameras scrambled to follow her. Jimmy stood frozen at his desk, hands still raised from his last gesture, completely bewildered. The band stopped playing. The producers in the control room were frantically asking through headsets what was happening. And in row 7, seat 12, sat a 9-year-old boy with wide eyes and trembling hands, staring at Sandra Bullock as she walked directly toward him. This is the story of what happened that night. A story that wasn't in the script. A story that would change everyone in that studio, and millions watching at home. 6 hours earlier, the boy's name was Ethan. Ethan Mitchell, 9 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania. He wasn't supposed to be in New York. He wasn't supposed to be in that studio. 3 months ago, his mother, Claire, had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was grim. 6 months, maybe less. Claire had one wish: take Ethan to see The Tonight Show. She had watched Jimmy Fallon every night since Ethan was born. It was her ritual, her escape, her small piece of joy. But the tickets were impossible to get. The waiting list was months long. The medical bills were piling up. There was no money for travel, no energy left for hope. Then, 2 weeks ago, a nurse at the hospital who had overheard Claire talking about her dream made a phone call. A local charity stepped in. And somehow, miraculously, they got 2 tickets. Not just any taping. The night Sandra Bullock, Claire's favorite actress, would be the guest. But what happened next, no one in that studio could have predicted. Not the producers. Not Jimmy. Not even Sandra herself. Claire almost didn't make it. The morning of the taping, she collapsed in the hotel bathroom. Ethan found her, called 911, and for 20 agonizing minutes thought his mother was dying right there on the cold tile floor. The paramedics stabilized her, but the doctors at the ER said she needed to rest. Claire refused. She looked at Ethan, saw the desperate hope in his eyes, and she told the doctors she was going to that show. Against medical advice, she checked herself out. They took a cab to Rockefeller Center. When they arrived, a production assistant saw Claire struggling to walk and offered a wheelchair. She refused. "I'm walking into that studio," she said quietly. "I'm walking in, and I'm walking out." They took their seats in row 7. Claire squeezed Ethan's hand. "This is it, baby. This is our night." The show started. Jimmy's monologue was sharp, funny, the audience roaring with laughter. Ethan watched his mother's face light up for the first time in months. She was smiling, really smiling, the kind of smile he hadn't seen since before the diagnosis. Then Sandra Bullock walked out, and Claire's eyes filled with tears. Not sad tears. Grateful ones. Ethan saw it, the way his mother looked at Sandra like she was seeing an old friend, someone who had been there through countless lonely nights, flickering on a TV screen, making her laugh when everything else hurt. Sandra was brilliant, as always. Charming, self-deprecating, telling stories that had the audience in stitches. Jimmy was on fire, the chemistry between them electric. Everything was perfect. And then, mid-story, Sandra's gaze drifted across the audience. She was talking about her kids, about motherhood, about the challenges of balancing career and family. Her eyes moved naturally across the crowd, making eye contact, connecting. And then she saw them. Row 7, seat 12. A little boy, holding the hand of a woman who looked like she was holding on to life itself. Sandra stopped talking. Mid-sentence. The studio fell into a confused silence. Jimmy turned to her, concerned. Sandra? You okay? She didn't answer him. She was staring at Ethan and Claire. And in that moment, something passed between them. Sandra couldn't explain it later, when reporters asked. But she saw something. She saw a mother and son who weren't supposed to be there. She saw love that was running out of time. She saw herself, years ago, holding her own mother's hand in a hospital room, wishing for just one more moment. She didn't think. She just moved. The microphone hit the chair with a soft thud. She stood up, walked past Jimmy's desk, down the steps, through the gap between the stage and the front row. The cameras followed, confused operators trying to keep up. The audience murmured, unsure what was happening. Jimmy stood at his desk, completely frozen, watching Sandra walk into the audience. She stopped in front of Ethan and Claire. The camera zoomed in. Millions watching at home saw what happened next. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Sandra knelt down in front of Ethan. The boy was crying now, overwhelmed, not understanding what was happening but feeling the enormity of it. Claire was trembling, tears streaming down her face. Sandra looked at Claire first. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Claire," the woman whispered. "And this is Ethan." Sandra smiled, that warm, genuine smile that had made her America's sweetheart for decades. "Hi, Ethan." "Hi, Claire." She reached out and took Claire's hand. "I don't know your story," Sandra said quietly, "but I can see it. I can see you're fighting. I can see you're here for him." She nodded toward Ethan. "And I can see how much he loves you." Claire couldn't speak. She just nodded, sobbing now, the kind of deep sobs that come from unbearable pain and unexpected grace. Sandra turned to Ethan. "You're a brave boy, aren't you?" Ethan nodded, wiping his eyes. "I try to be. For my mom." And that's when Sandra Bullock did something that no one, not even Jimmy Fallon, ever expected. She reached up and unclasped the necklace she was wearing. It was simple, elegant, a small silver pendant with a single diamond. She'd worn it to every major event for the past decade. It had been her mother's. Her mother, who had passed away from cancer when Sandra was just starting her career. Her mother, who never got to see her daughter become a star. Sandra held the necklace in her hand for a moment, staring at it. Then she looked at Claire. "My mom gave this to me before she died," Sandra said, her own voice breaking now. "She told me to wear it whenever I needed to remember that love doesn't end. It just changes shape." She gently placed the necklace in Claire's hand, closing her fingers around it. "I want you to have it. I want you to give it to Ethan someday, when he needs to remember you." The studio erupted. Not in applause. In something else. A collective gasp, a shared intake of breath, the sound of 200 people witnessing something sacred. Jimmy Fallon had moved from behind his desk now, standing at the edge of the stage, his hand over his mouth, tears streaming down his face. The band members were crying. The camera operators were crying. In the control room, hardened producers who had seen everything were wiping their eyes. Sandra stood up, pulled Claire into an embrace, then knelt down again and hugged Ethan. The boy clung to her, sobbing into her shoulder, and Sandra held him like she would her own child. "You're going to be okay," she whispered to him. "You're so loved. And that love is going to carry you through everything." She stood, helped Claire to her feet, and then, with her arm around Claire's shoulders, walked with them back toward the stage. The audience rose. Every single person. A standing ovation that lasted 5 full minutes. Jimmy walked down to meet them, embracing Claire, then Ethan, then Sandra. No words. Just presence. Just humanity. Behind the scenes, something else was happening that the cameras didn't catch. While Sandra was in the audience, Jimmy had made a decision. He grabbed a producer and whispered something urgent. The producer nodded, made a call. By the time Sandra, Claire, and Ethan reached the stage, Jimmy had already arranged for the network to cover all of Claire's medical bills. He had called his personal physician, a top oncologist, and arranged for Claire to get a second opinion, experimental treatments, anything that might give her more time. All of this in 3 minutes, while Sandra was holding Claire's hand. When they reached the stage, Jimmy pulled Claire aside and told her quietly what he had done. She collapsed into his arms. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this?" Jimmy held her. "Because you showed up," he said simply. "You're dying, and you showed up for your son. That's everything. How could I not help?" The show didn't continue as planned. They scrapped the rest of the scheduled segments. Instead, Jimmy sat on the stage floor with Sandra, Claire, and Ethan. They talked. Not as celebrities and audience members, but as people. Claire told her story. Sandra shared hers. Ethan talked about his mom, about how strong she was, about how scared he was. Jimmy listened, held space for the pain and the beauty of it all. The cameras kept rolling, but it stopped feeling like television. It felt like church. The audience didn't move. They stayed, bearing witness. At one point, Jimmy stood up, walked to his desk, and pulled out a small notebook. His joke notebook, the one he'd kept since he first started doing stand-up as a teenager. He walked back to Claire and placed it in her hands. "I want Ethan to have this," Jimmy said. "This book represents never giving up on joy. Even when life is hard. Your mom is teaching you that right now, Ethan. She's showing you how to fight for joy." He looked at Claire. "And when the time comes, when Ethan needs to remember how to laugh again, I want him to have this." Claire held the notebook like it was made of gold. "Thank you," she whispered. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The taping ended 2 hours late. No one complained. When Claire and Ethan finally left the studio, they didn't leave alone. Sandra walked them out. Jimmy followed, carrying Ethan on his shoulders, making the boy laugh for the first time all night. Outside, a car was waiting, a private car that would take them back to their hotel, then to the hospital for Claire's appointment with the oncologist Jimmy had arranged. Before they got in, Sandra took off her jacket and wrapped it around Claire's shoulders. "Keep fighting," she said. "Not for me. For him. For every moment you can steal back." Claire nodded, holding the necklace in one hand and Jimmy's notebook in the other. Ethan hugged Sandra, then Jimmy, then climbed into the car with his mother. As it pulled away, Jimmy and Sandra stood on the sidewalk, watching it disappear. "That was real," Sandra said quietly. "That wasn't television." Jimmy nodded. "Yeah. That was the realest thing we'll ever do." They stood there for a long moment. Then Sandra turned to him. "You know that's all going to air, right?" Jimmy shrugged. "Let it air. Let people see what happens when you stop pretending and just show up for each other." Sandra smiled. "You're a good man, Jimmy Fallon." 3 months later, Claire Mitchell passed away. Ethan was with her, holding her hand, wearing the necklace Sandra had given them. In her final hours, she held Jimmy's joke notebook on her chest. Her last words to Ethan were simple. "Find your joy, baby. Find it and never let it go." The funeral was small. But there were 2 unexpected attendees. Sandra Bullock and Jimmy Fallon, who flew in quietly, sat in the back, and left before anyone could ask questions. After the funeral, Ethan gave the necklace to his aunt, but he kept the notebook. He still has it. He reads it sometimes, on hard days, when he misses his mother. And he remembers that night, the night the world stopped for his mom. Jimmy Fallon never talked about that episode publicly. When reporters asked, he simply said, "Some moments are bigger than television." But people who worked on the show said he was different afterward. Softer. More present. He started a private foundation that helps families dealing with terminal illness. Sandra Bullock became a major donor. They don't talk about it. They just do the work. The episode aired exactly as it happened. Unedited. Raw. Real. It became the most watched Tonight Show episode in history. Not because of celebrity gossip, but because people saw something they rarely see: genuine humanity. They saw a woman fighting death to give her son one perfect night. They saw two celebrities who could have stayed in their chairs. But instead they got up. They showed up. They gave pieces of themselves they could never get back. And in doing so, they created something that will outlive every joke, every film, every award. They created a moment of grace. A reminder that the most powerful thing we can do is simply be present for each other's pain. That's Jimmy Fallon's legacy. Not the laughs, not the games. It's this: the night he stopped being a host and became a human being. The night Sandra Bullock gave away her mother's necklace. The night a dying woman and her son reminded an entire studio that love is the only thing that survives us.